Well, thanks so much for joining us today. It's really nice to see everybody coming into the waiting room from so many different time zones. So, thanks for spending part of your morning with us. If you're on the West Coast, afternoon on the West Coast, and early evening to our friends in the UK and EU. So, again, a pleasure to always have a few minutes of your time to talk about what we're seeing in admissions. It has been a very busy fall, and so wanted to take a moment to share with you what we're seeing. First of all, we've seen the majority of acceptances from early action and most of the early decisions. There is still a handful of early action schools like the University of Michigan, and some of the other larger public institutions, University of Texas, Wisconsin, Virginia, etc. Those early actions have not yet come back and are due at the end of January. But we do have quite a bit of data that we're collecting at the moment, and so wanted to share what we're seeing in terms of the trends, and then also to sort of just talk through briefly what students and parents should be doing if they were rejected or if they were deferred. So just to sort of level set and give you guys some perspective on what we are seeing in terms of decisions and acceptance rates, it really isn't too surprising. Again, incredibly competitive in the early decision round, but admissions rates that have sort of, for the most part, not jumped too significantly in a negative way. They have, in many cases, gone down. You see at Emory, 37%, Boston College at 30%, Williams at 27%, Northwestern at 25%, and Dartmouth and Brown at 19 and 13% respectively. In most cases, these are lower acceptance rates in the early decision round than they were last year. Again, more applications almost across the board universally for students applying under the ED programs. One interesting statistic or non-statistic to bring up is, Penn did not report statistics so far from its early decision round. It is saying that it won't report statistics as part of their process of not wanting kids to and parents to over focus on the data or the statistics, much like Stanford. I think the reality is it does the opposite. It makes a very confusing process even more opaque and less transparent. But I think that's actually a trend that you're going to see more universities sort of hide under the cover of, hey, we're not revealing specific admissions data, which we find concerning, but there it is nonetheless. One thing to also just sort of think about as you look at these numbers is this is the acceptance rate. And so it's the number of kids who have applied to the number of kids who were offered. We're not yet talking about how many actual seats were filled. And in some cases, for example, like at Williams, their admissions rate was lower, but they actually filled more ED spots this year because they had more applicants to do so. So as application numbers rise, admissions rates drop, and then you're seeing, a percentage of the class, which we'll talk about briefly in a minute, anywhere from sort of 30 to 50% of that freshman class is being filled in the early decision round. Again, at schools offering restrictive early action, these are just four examples. Notre Dame, Georgetown, Yale, and Harvard all saw sort of record number of applicants in most cases. And Harvard obviously leading the way. They were just over 7.5% acceptance rate. They deferred approximately 75% of their early round and then rejected the balance. So not very many kids getting rejection notices straight up, a lot of kids being deferred. That's one strategy that we've seen from the Ivies. We'll talk briefly about the other strategy we're seeing from the Ivies, but very interesting to see Harvard, again, deferring so many students in that early round. Again, the one thing I would just sort of say about restrictive early action, we're continuing to see a really strong focus around athletes, legacy, and donors. So people that have institutional connection to the university. And because the restrictive early action is not binding, these universities are looking at those applicants, and not only are they asking themselves, are they qualified? Are they a good fit for our university? Do they have institutional connections? But is the likelihood that this student is going to enroll if we give them an offer is really becoming a key part of the conversation. So colleges, as we have said in prior webinars, are very focused on their yield. They are trying to understand how many offers do we have to give in order to enroll the proper number of students in order to hit budget. This is just one example, just wanted to highlight sort of, you hear the trend about acceptance rates dropping both in early and in regular overall. And this is just a graph from Northwestern. So it just gives you sort of a perspective over the last 16, 17, 18 years. You know, while there are sort of, ups and downs along the way, the trend lines are very evident, and they are low to the right, and they're continuing to do that. So what it tells us is that overall acceptance rates are going down, early decision acceptance rates are going down, and thus schools like Northwestern are just becoming more and more competitive every year. We spoke a little bit earlier about what Harvard had done, and Harvard's process, and what their strategy this year was: accept a small percentage, 7.5%, defer a very, very large percentage of the class, just north of 70%, and then reject a smaller amount. Well, Brown went the other way. Brown decided to reject 70% nearly of their freshman ED applicants. They deferred just under 20%, and they accepted a record low 13% in ED. So they basically said, we're going to defer a small pile of kids, we're going to accept a small pile of kids, and then everybody else from the early round is going to be out. And then we will re-look at our class in that regular round. And what that basically says is, they believe, in conjunction with the 13% of the kids that they've accepted, which is under ED and which is binding, so many, many, many of them, if not all, will enroll. They are assuming that they will be able to fill their class with the 19% of kids deferred, so that they really are confident that when they get their larger percentage of applicants overall in the regular round, that they're going to be in a very good place to fill the class. And so, other schools have done it a different way, where they've decided to defer and waitlist large groups of kids in an effort to sort of batch and mitigate their yield. Brown feels like they're not going to need to do that this year. But time will tell if they're correct. But that's the strategy that we've seen from Brown. So wanted to highlight it for you. So, what are we seeing? Again, part of what we touched on just briefly, continued focus on students out of legacy, mom and dad that went to those universities and have been active alumni, families that are development cases or have the ability or have a track record of giving and being supportive to universities. We often think of time, treasure, and talent, right? What are those folks doing for the universities that help the universities live out their mission? We're continuing to see student athletics become an even bigger part of that early round. Almost all of our recruited athletes this year were asked to go under one of the early programs. So coaches and admissions officers are clearly earmarking spots in the early round for those athletes. And those athletes are getting in at a much, much higher clip than any other demographic, right? Something like 90 to 95% of all student athletes who apply with a quote unquote tag are accepted. And then diversity continues to be a trend that we see. Again, universities looking for students that will create well-rounded classes. They are not looking for well-rounded students. They are looking for well-rounded classes. So they are thinking about the diversity of their class in terms of geographic breakdown, economic breakdown, and all kinds of factors that will help them really create what they would call a diverse culture, a diverse community within the campus. And for different universities, that means very different things. But we're continuing to see that be a part of how they select students from across the United States and across the world. A little bit of the good news is that, again, part of our concern with COVID and sort of the pandemic and the financial challenges that most of these institutions of higher learning have had over the last few years, we thought that there was a strong potential that universities would move to filling more and more of their freshman class in ED, and it definitely has increased over the last 10 years, but it has remained fairly flat over the last 3 to 4 cycles. And that's good news. That means about 35 to 50% of the freshman class at most of these universities is being filled in ED. While that is a lot, and it's either a third or a half of the class, it isn't the 60 or 70% that we were thinking could have potentially been the case. There has been some outliers. Tulane last year filled about 90% of its class between early decision 1 and early decision 2. But that was really an outlier. That was really not the norm. And so this is good news, meaning that when students are applying in the regular room and the regular round, there are still spots available for them, and that is going to be a plus. And that again is going to allow students the opportunity, if they were deferred or rejected at their early schools, this is going to give them an opportunity to apply to a wide breadth of schools where there is opportunity. Again, a little bit more competitive than in the early decision round, but nonetheless still an opportunity to get acceptances and to find the right fit. And then lastly, and you've heard us here at ESM talk about this, and my colleague Adam Malouche, who's head of our test prep group, significantly about test optional. I mean, test optional is really good for it is really good for institutions. It is really bad for most applicants, right? It takes away an opportunity for a student to stand out. It takes away an opportunity for a student to show that they are compelling in terms of their academic rigor. And again, when you're sort of comparing apples and oranges, it's very hard to make a justification of why you took one student and not another. And so in this case, as students are going through the admissions process, there's some students that have test scores and there are some that don't. And to sort of try to evaluate and compare those students is very difficult. And so, we still sort of believe that if a student can test and can test well, it is to their benefit to have a strong test score. And certainly, if you look at the percent of kids who are getting in an early decision with a test score, it does seem to appear that those school students are getting in at a higher percentage than those without a test score. And the other way we know that is because of the lack of transparent data that the universities are not in sort of aggregate providing us that. So some are sort of dripping and sharing it in drips and drabs, but as a whole, universities are sort of withholding the data between how many kids and what percentage of kids do we take in the early round with a test score, and how much and how many do we take without. And so in the cases of the universities that have shared that information, it's not surprising to find out kids with test scores got in at a higher clip. So, if you're deferred, you're rejected, what do you do now? It is not the end of the world. It is not a sign of anything to come. There's just some things you need to do now to sort of get on with it and get back on the horse. One is considering to apply under early decision 2 programs. Early decision 2, simply just a later early decision. 10 years ago, early decision 2 did not exist. It was not really a strategy that most people used, and it wasn't really offered by many schools. Today, it's offered by a variety of schools, from Emory to WashU to Tufts and many others. If one of those schools is a right fit and could potentially be a number 2 choice, and as a university where the student is willing to commit themselves, applying early decision 2 is a statistical advantage, right? It's a higher percentage chance of getting in than in regular at that particular university, almost in all cases. And generally, smaller applicant pool. So the ability to sort of be in an applicant pool that isn't overrun with numbers, show the demonstrated interest to that university that they are your now top choice. And by applying binding early decision, you would find out by February 15th. So thinking through that process is important. Then sitting down and making sure that all your remaining applications are submitted, thinking through if you want to add additional schools to that list, and getting everything in by the deadlines. Deadlines generally are going to range between January 1st and February 1st, with some also on January 15th. For the schools that you were deferred at, it is really important to keep in touch with them. So sending a continued interest letter, sending your fall grades, sending any update that's material, right? You don't have to update them and tell them you got an A on a French test. But if you got an award at school, if your soccer team won the championship, if you made the varsity basketball team or just joined the investment club, these are all material changes to your application in which you can update these schools and let them know, hey, I am interested. This is a place that I'm really, really keen to attend. I'm looking forward to maybe coming and visiting this spring. Is there anything you need from me? You could also potentially send additional letters to schools that allow that. So, after you've submitted all your applications, the month of January and early February is really your opportunity to go on the PR trip and really just push through as much additional information to these schools so they know that you're interested. Again, they are looking at their deferred list, their wait lists, and they are trying to figure out, if I give that person a yes, an acceptance letter, what is the chance they are going to, who they're going to show up. And that's something that's really important to them. Also, it is really helpful to consult with your school counselor to have a better understanding of how their class is shaping up in terms of who was accepted and who wasn't, who was deferred, how many kids are applying in the early decision to pool to a school you might be considering. So it is really, really helpful to get that sort of context from the school counselor. So again, if you got rejected or deferred, it is not sort of like, hey, it's over and there's not going to be any opportunities. It's important to just stay focused, stay on plan, and continue to finish the process and really allow this process to work itself out. Obviously, it's always more beneficial if you can get in early and put some of this behind you. But for the vast majority of applicants, that's just not the case. So it's important to sort of hang in there and continue to push through and continue to work hard in school academically and deliver great grades. And then lastly, just sort of a reality check for all of us. A rejection or deferral is not a reflection of a poor application or a poor narrative. It's a reflection of an increasingly competitive applicant pool and an increasingly competitive applicant pool where the goalposts are always changing on kids. You're going from I need a great SAT score to now it's test optional, and in some schools it's test blind. Do I need to take 10 APs or 5 APs? But wait a second, I thought you were test optional, but you're still looking at AP scores. So it is a really confusing process. It's a really opaque process, and it's a really subjective process from the universities. And so it is just really important that kids remain self-confident, they continue to push themselves, they continue to work hard, and they continue to understand that one school saying no is not a reflection on their abilities, their successes, their achievements. It's just a reflection of, in that moment, in that time, it wasn't a good fit. And so applying to a broad base of schools now will give them that opportunity to find acceptances, to find the schools that they're excited about, and to have a really great career in college. So important to keep the faith and let the process work itself out. Always a pleasure to see everybody, and wishing everybody a very happy and safe holidays, and we will certainly keep you updated as we continue to collect more data over the next couple of months. And if we can ever be of any assistance, please reach out anytime. Talk to you soon. Happy holidays.